With a staggering 4.5%, Denmark ended 2024 with the highest government GDP to budget surplus ratio within the EU. Yes, you heard that right. While the GDP of countries like France fell by 0.1% and Germany's growth stalled at 0.2%, tiny Denmark was sprinting ahead.
The bonds between Denmark and US are very strong, and what we don't need is barriers for more investments and more job creating and more growth.
Well, you might be wondering, how does a country of just under 6 million people defy so much economic gravity while tightening its borders harder than any other Nordic nation? How does a country that pushed out so many migrants grow faster than those that are still welcoming them in? In this video, we will take a look at the unusual reason behind Denmark's economic growth in the face of an immigration war. Let's get started. Denmark, like much of Europe, entered a brief recession back in the second quarter of 2020 after the COVID-19 pandemic crippled the world's economy. With a GDP that was shrinking at 1.8% at the time, Denmark mirrored the damage felt across the EU. Yet unlike most of its neighbors, Denmark didn't stay down for long, and by the end of 2021, its economy had rebounded by over 7.4%. However, that was just the beginning. Fast forward to 2024, Denmark reported another GDP growth of over 3.7%, alongside keeping its inflation well below 2%, and public debt to GDP ratio at 31% according to Eurostat. In fact, the Danish government not only avoided taking on new debt to stimulate the economy, it also managed to consistently run on budget surpluses, 0.36% in 2020, 4.1% in 2021, 3.4% in 2022, 3.3% in 2023, and 4.5% in 2024. In a region facing rising fiscal deficits, these numbers seemed almost unbelievable. At the same time, Denmark's approach to immigration was undergoing a massive turnaround. In 2019, the Danish government began to move away from the idea of long-term integration for asylum seekers. Instead, the state began to emphasize self-support and return as its official policy. Then, in April 2021, Denmark became the first EU country to revoke the residency permits for Syrian refugees, citing that Damascus was now safe to return to. This was a move that became widely condemned by human rights organizations as refugees were given a choice to either leave voluntarily or stay in deportation centers indefinitely. This hard stance was not just a short-term political ploy, it became a mainstay of Danish policy and was embraced by both left and right coalitions. By 2022, the immigration approval had dropped drastically as the country continued to withdraw its temporary protection for Syrian refugees. Denmark also began advocating for outsourcing asylum procedures to third countries, similar to UK's Rwanda plan. While that idea hasn't materialized, the intent was very clear. Now here's the paradox. At the very moment Denmark was clamping down on its immigration crisis, its economy was booming. You might want to ask, how does this make sense? Isn't immigration supposed to bring labor and growth? How can a country that seems to be pushing people out be outperforming nations that continue to welcome them? Well, unlike most EU nations that rely heavily on immigrant labor for service and low-skilled jobs, Denmark's economic engine runs on sectors that do not require large numbers of low-wage workers. In fact, the country has maintained the fifth highest employment rates position in the EU, while still managing to increase its productivity over the past decade. Even more impressively, this feat was achieved while the country maintained high wages. Denmark does not have statutory minimum wage, yet most workers across menial sectors earn above 15 euros per hour due to its strong collective bargaining agreements. High wages are often seen as a barrier to employment, but Denmark has proven otherwise with its employment rate reaching 77.7% in 2024. Indeed, the Danish models work differently. Instead of importing low-wage labor to fill gaps, Denmark invests heavily in its education, training, and digital upskilling. Alongside a flexible labor market and generous welfare policies, Denmark has also built a system where jobs evolve and workers adapt without needing large waves of new arrivals. One of the biggest forces behind Denmark's economic boom is the name that's now known around the world, Novo Nordisk. Based in a suburb of Copenhagen, Novo Nordisk is the pharmaceutical giant responsible for producing Wegovy and Ozempic, substances originally designed to treat diabetes but now globally sought after for their weight loss effects. By 2023, demand for both substances went high, especially in the United States, where over 40% of its users are considered to be on the plus size. Ozempic in particular became a cultural buzzword and was featured in memes, TikTok trends, and late-night talk shows. However, behind the pop culture was a booming business. In 2024, Novo Nordisk briefly surpassed LVMH to become the most valuable company in Europe with a market capitalization of over $424 billion. Novo's profits surged at the time by more than 50%, and its contribution to Denmark's GDP became undeniable. According to estimates by Danske Bank, roughly half of Denmark's GDP growth for 2023 and 2024 was directly tied to Novo Nordisk's success. But this isn't just about the success of one company. The rise of Novo Nordisk no doubt reflected Denmark's investment in high-skilled industries, as the country is known for supporting STEM education, public-private partnerships, and research funding. For decades, Denmark has focused on funding sectors such as biotech, pharmaceuticals, renewable energy, and digital health. It's no wonder that even as Denmark reduced its intake of low-skilled immigrants, it continued to attract specialized workers and researchers through its selective visa programs. The Danish government expanded its positive list scheme in 2023 to fast-track work permits for professionals in shortage areas across biotech engineers, IT developers, and medical researchers. This move kept the talented pipeline open without increasing the pressure on the welfare system. Another major strength for Denmark has been wind energy. Denmark produces nearly 50% of its electricity from wind, which makes it one of the world leaders in renewable energy. And while taxes make these domestic electricity bills high, the country's industrial energy costs remain among the lowest in Europe, which in turn allows manufacturers to remain competitive without relying on subsidies or imported labor. This has protected Denmark's industrial base even as other countries watch their factories shutter. Unlike EU economies, which heavily rely on cheap labor to maintain productivity, Denmark has demonstrated that fewer workers can lead to better outcomes, provided they are well-trained, well-paid, and working in the right industries. But what pushed Denmark to take such a dramatic stance on its immigration in the first place? And how does a generous welfare state justify sending people back to war-torn countries? That's where the real controversy begins. To understand Denmark's sudden attitude toward immigration, we have to go back to what the country values most: its welfare state. For most Danes, this isn't just a policy, but a way of life. The idea that everyone, regardless of their background, could access free healthcare, education, and social protections had always been part of Denmark's national identity. The Danish welfare system dates back to the late 19th century, with the introduction of old age pensions and health insurance laws under the leadership of politicians like J.C. Christensen. Over the decades, this system grew significantly, especially after World War II. By the 1950s and 60s, Denmark had built a model welfare state that offered universal healthcare, free higher education, subsidized childcare, and unemployment insurance that could last for up to 2 years. Today, Denmark's public spending represents nearly 40% of its GDP. Its citizens pay for it through taxes, where the average income tax rate sits at 46% amid a top marginal tax rate of 55.9%. But for many Danes, this system has long been seen as a fair trade. High taxes in exchange for security, dignity, and opportunity. However, the sustainability of this model is always on a delicate balance. For any welfare system to function, the majority of people in the country must be contributing more than what they take out. In practical terms, that means a strong labor force, high employment, and consistent tax revenue. When that balance is upset, the system starts to show cracks, and that's exactly what many Danes believe began to happen. Between 2010 and 2020, immigration to Denmark increased consistently, and by the start of 2025, over 12.6% of Denmark's population now has a foreign background. While some immigrants blended well into the Danish society, many actually found it difficult to find stable employment, especially those from war-torn or low-income countries with limited education. A 2018 report by the Danish Ministry of Finance revealed something striking. Non-Western immigrants cost the state 31 billion kroner every year. That's about $4.7 billion. However, Immigrants from Western countries like Germany, the UK, and the US had a net positive contribution, and this difference came down to employment and income levels. Another study in 2020 found that non-Western immigrants were overrepresented among social benefit recipients, particularly in categories like unemployment assistance and housing support. This wasn't a result of laziness or unwillingness, but because many were refugees who had faced trauma, language barriers, and cultural shock. Even more concerning to Danish policymakers was that its pattern often continued into the second generation. Children of non-Western immigrants were statistically less likely to complete their higher education and also more likely to rely on welfare than their Danish-born peers. By 2022, only 47% of non-Western descendants aged 30 to 39 were in full-time employment compared to 77% of ethnic Danes in the same age group. The growing fiscal strain became a heated political issue as it wasn't just about culture or borders anymore. It became a question of whether the entire foundation of the Danish welfare system could survive if too many residents took more than they contributed. By the time the current Prime Minister and leader of the Social Democrats, Mette Frederiksen, took office in 2019, Denmark's political consensus had shifted to a large extent. Left and right-wing parties began echoing a new line of restricting immigration as being essential not only for culture, but for the economic survival of the welfare system. This marked a turning point, but policy changes didn't happen in speeches alone. The country's stance soon turned into concrete government actions that redefined what it meant to be a refugee in Denmark. Toward the end of 2019, Denmark officially began to rebrand its immigration policy. The term integration was quietly phased out in government documents and replaced with a new phrase, self-sufficiency and repatriation. This was indeed turning into a national philosophy. The new government's position was clear. Refugees were welcome only as long as they were needed or unsafe to return to their country. As soon as their home country was deemed safe, the goal would shift from helping them build a new life in Denmark to helping them go right back home. This strategy, often referred to as the paradigm shift, was endorsed by both the Social Democrats and right-leaning parties like the Danish People's Party. The most high-profile example of this policy came in April 2021, when the Danish Immigration Service claimed that parts of Damascus and surrounding areas were now safe for the Syrian refugees to return home. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International and the UNHCR, condemned the decision as they argued that Syria remained unsafe due to the arbitrary arrests and political repressions that was still going on. Nonetheless, Denmark stood firm with its decision, but those affected were not deported forcibly. Instead, they were told to stay in deportation centers until they either accepted voluntary return or relocated to a third country. Some critics argued this created a state of permanent uncertainty with no path to normalcy. Another major policy introduced around the same time was the controversial ghetto package. First launched in 2018 and revised subsequently, the package targeted areas with high concentrations of immigrants, especially those from non-Western countries. Some neighborhoods were labeled ghettos if they met criteria such as low employment, low education levels, and high crime rates of over 50%. Once labeled, these neighborhoods were now subject to radical reforms, and one of the most debated measures was the mandatory daycare rule. What this meant was that starting at age 1, children in these areas were required to attend at least 25 hours of weekly instruction in Danish language, values, and culture. Parents who failed to comply risked losing social benefits. In addition, the ghetto law allowed for public housing units to be demolished or sold off to private investors. The goal was to reduce the percentage of non-Western residents in these areas to below 30% by 2030. This meant forcibly relocating families, sometimes against their wishes, to reshape the neighborhood's demographic profile. While these policies drew widespread criticisms internationally, they found significant support within Denmark, and such support was even higher among working-class voters. Through all of this, Denmark has no doubt redefined what it means to offer protection to its citizenry. But as its demographics shifted and fiscal concerns grew, the country began to redraw the lines between compassion and capacity. Multiple reports from Denmark's Ministry of Immigration and Integration revealed that nearly one-third of children aged 10 to 14 from non-Western backgrounds were living in relative poverty. This was further defined as a household earning less than 50% of the national median income. In comparison, only 2% of Danish-born children in that same age group fell below that line. These raised the alarm not only among economists and social workers, but among ordinary Danish citizens who had long believed in the promise of an equal opportunity for all. At first glance, poverty might seem like a matter of income alone, but when poverty persists across generations, even in a country with free education, healthcare, and strong public services like Denmark, it often signals a much deeper problem. And in the case of Denmark, this was a problem that was increasingly seen through the lens of public safety and crime. New figures from Denmark show a very high level of crime committed, especially by groups of non-Western men. Approximately 55% of men born in 1987 with Syrian, Lebanese, and Somali backgrounds are convicted according to the criminal code. However, Danish authorities are very careful not to blame all migrants for the actions of a few. But in the eyes of the public, patterns matter, and the perception of increased insecurity, especially in low-income neighborhoods, has grown significantly in recent years. Over 65% of Danes believe that crime has increased due to immigration, particularly from outside Europe. Whether or not this belief is statistically airtight, the emotional truth behind it is still powerful and politically influential. And again, these fears have only grown stronger when viewed against the backdrop of what's happening across the bridge in Sweden. Once known for its calm cities and peaceful suburbs, Sweden also found itself amid a deep gang violence crisis. Back in 2022 alone, there were about 391 fatal shootings across Sweden, the highest ever recorded in Swedish history. That same year, the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention reported that gun violence in Stockholm was nearly 30 times higher than in London. What makes Sweden's case even more alarming for Danes is that the spike in violence has also been linked primarily to failed integration. Police reports and journalistic investigations have repeatedly shown that many of those involved in gang activity also come from migrant backgrounds, particularly in areas like Rinkeby and Tensta. Now, many Danes feel like strangers in their cities. In areas such as Tingberg and Brunbystrand, residents are now speaking out about feeling unsafe, unheard, and probably outnumbered. Complaints range from rising petty theft to gang recruitment in schools. For Denmark, safety and social cohesion are not just about values, they are boundaries, and the fear of losing them is shaping a whole new era of politics in Europe. Let's find out how. As Denmark tightens its borders and reshapes its policy on immigration, something bigger is happening behind the scenes. This is a shift that's beginning to spread all across European politics. At the heart of this shift is what political scientists call Overton window. An Overton window is the range of ideas that were frowned at but now considered acceptable in public discourse. To this effect, Denmark became the unofficial leader of a bloc of 15 EU member states that began calling for outsourcing of EU migration policy. This coalition, comprising Austria, Czechia, Poland, and Greece, has since prompted the European Commission to adopt stronger border controls and expedite agreements with non-EU countries. Denmark has also been a champion of the idea behind pre-border asylum processing. It argued that people should apply for protection before arriving in the EU rather than after crossing the border, though this approach has since raised legal and ethical concerns. What makes Denmark's model especially influential is that it didn't come from a far-right populist government, but a center-left coalition government led by Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen. This blurs the lines between progressive and conservative politics, allowing tougher policies to enter mainstream governance without the usual stigma of extremism. In doing so, Denmark has successfully created a playbook that other governments in the EU are now studying. In fact, Germany's 2024 debate on immigrant neighborhood quotas centered on the same talking points first introduced in Denmark's ghetto legislation. Likewise, Italy's push for asylum agreement with Tunisia mirrors Denmark's earlier proposals for third country processing. Denmark, on the other hand, is running surpluses, increasing its productivity and maintaining low unemployment, all while limiting the inflow of low-skilled migrants. Is this model sustainable? Can it be copied elsewhere without the unique social contract, cohesion, and characteristics of Danish society? And will the benefits of tighter immigration last in the long run, or simply shift the burden elsewhere? These are tough questions, but one thing is certain. The age of open door migration policies in Europe is ending, and at the center of that change is a small Nordic nation that's proving just how much influence a country of 6 million can have when it dares to redraw the lines. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please ensure to hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.